Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Gina. Thank you, Helen, and the team for organizing such a lovely event, and actually for the Museums Trust for hosting us. I think it's so inspiring to be in a place of learning and discovery. And it's been humbling to sit in sessions where I've learned a lot. I think I now know a lot more of my known unknowns. And it's been great to see such interdisciplinary work being done for the digital good, which I think really matters at this time. So as Gina said, I do a lot of work. I do a lot of active research, basic research, often in the medical sciences space. But I also do a lot of policy advice. I'm one of 15 experts on the Department for Education Science Advisory Council. I directed the independent research evidence review for the Department for Science, Innovation, Technology on social media last year. And I've give a range of advice to active politicians, governments, parliamentarians, and then try to do my best in communicating something that is inherently complex as digital life. We all know how complex digital life is because I think it's just life, but online and in a commercialized space. And I think everyone here has an important role to play to figure that out. I must admit, giving talks to, I give a lot of talks. The talks I am most concerned about are talks to close colleagues. I think none of us like standing up in front of their own department, and talks to broad ranges of researchers in areas that are potentially not aligned to mine. So today, I really want to take a personal experience. So I think across the last 5-10 years, I've become increasingly humble about what I can know, but I know at least what I've experienced and what I've learned in the process. And so I want to take you through that today. So the question about how the digital world impacts kids is so critical. And I think it's not just critical because children and young people are the futures of tomorrow. It's not just critical from, for example, a mental health perspective, where we know that 50% of those who will experience a mental health condition in their lives will have that first symptom before 18. It's not just because identity develops and who we are becomes who we actually are. It's critical also because I think we see young people as a reflection of our society. We see things that go wrong in adulthood, and we're kind of like, oh, well, we can't really change that, but we want to change it for those that come next. So I started studying social media because my generation is the first to have used social media at school. I remember Facebook coming into my school classroom. I was in Germany at the time, and we actually had a pre-Facebook social media called SchülerVZ, and it was bright pink, and you got to match people from your school and from neighboring schools, and we had MSN, and you'd go home and you'd log into MSN, and then you'd log on again because you want to remind people you're online. It was a big part of my adolescence, and I felt when I was an undergrad and I was reading the scientific literature about social media and the online world, it was written by loads of people who had no clue what was actually going on, the positives and the negatives. And I think that complexity has driven me forward to try to understand this to date. I went and did a PhD on social media, and at that time, well, before then, Trump hadn't been elected, and people, at least in psychology, were a bit like, okay, you're doing a PhD on social media. But in around 2015, 17, the mood music changed, and we started getting a lot more concerned. So I did a lot of work on, initial work on the concerns around mental health declines. At the end of my PhD, I actually was writing my introduction. I went into the library and I thought, well, maybe I should read some historical papers on tech. And I think similar to, I wasn't in the session that Rena mentioned, but I started looking into the past. And so I think the first experience that really shaped me, the first experience was me using social media as a teen. But the second was realizing how similar some of the things I was talking about in my thesis were to what people had been discussing 50, 60, 100 years ago. So this is a quote, and I'll just read it out and just think about what this might be about. So here's a device that is everywhere. We may question the quality of its offering for our children. We may approve or deplore its entertainments and enchantments, but we are powerless to shut it out. It comes into our very homes and captures our children before our very eyes. So I won't have you shout things out, and people have become quite good at this. But this was actually from a parenting magazine in the 1930s about the radio. And I'll just give you one more. No locks will keep this intruder out, nor can parents shift their children away from it. So that was also about the radio. And this was from the director of the Child Study Association of America. So these were professional organizations voicing concerns about, again, about young people, about their attention, about how they're using their time. And I went and dug deeper, and there was research being done by people, for example, Mary Preston at Stanford, who went and surveyed young people or studied them, those who were looking at radio, were listening to radio or watching movie dramas. And in her sort of psychiatric study, she talked about that these terrifying scenes from this media will have an inhibitory effect on the functioning of every organ in the body, and that most of the children utilize this addiction as an escape from reality, much as a chronic alcoholic does drink. I'm not saying that this is exactly what's happening with social media, but it struck me how similar even the words were: addiction, alcohol, powerlessness, how the feelings of these people seem very similar to ours. And maybe it is similar. You know, we're going through a time of massive social changes. And in the US, for example, here's some data. The use of the radio really peaked, or at least came to a certain level of usage around the 1940s when these concerns started emerging. So my big question started being, well, my big question to you and to us is, will we find this talk, these sessions, similarly kind of quietly hilarious in 90 years' time? Or will we say, actually, this was different? Actually, it was important to call this out. We are going in a direction that is not appropriate or not good. And my opinions have changed. I think for a long time I did feel like this is really cyclical. It seems to come and go with every single technology. But I think in the room today I also feel like we have changed, and there are things that we, at least I, would put money on saying now is different, even though now feels very similar to those concerns that were raised before. Before I go into that in more detail, I just want to think a bit about the research policy interface in this space as well, and how it's developed, because I was asked to talk about not kind of my basic research, but the work that I do in translating evidence into policy. And I find this a really interesting space. I think what research is for policy has changed over the last 100 years. What research is for society has changed in the last 100 years. Increasingly, research or researchers are seen as real power holders and answer holders in society. I'm sometimes surprised when people come up to me with very intimate questions about how they should live their lives, and feel like I will be able to give them that guidance, you know, for my qualification of, you know, coding on a laptop and looking at some data. And I think we have seen as a society a fundamental shift where we look for advice. We have seen a change in who we trust, in how, you know, our communities work. And I think as researchers, we're in a unique space where we are really consulted, but also where I think we need to be exceptionally careful that we don't take on a role that we shouldn't have. I think research is just one of many things that can help make better decisions. And I definitely think we should have evidence feeding into our decisions. But evidence or research or science isn't everything. It's not every single way of knowing. And so I think we need to also make sure that we're not playing a role where we shouldn't be by sort of prescribing from on high the answer for questions that people come to research for. So when I was doing my PhD, I spent a lot of time, well, not a lot of time, but some very foundational time having teas and coffees with a philosopher of science who was 90 at the time, called Jerome Ravitz, who wrote some fantastic books in the 70s around the role of science. And one of them was that the assumption was growing that every problem, personal or social, as well as natural or technical, should be amenable to the solution by the application of the appropriate science. And by science, I think we can be more inclusive here and say research. We as researchers can solve all the problems, and I think, we're seeing changes in UKRI policy and how we fund research, that research is there to solve practical problems in society, and we're here to deliver. And this is what we have to do in all our applications. Just give me that, additional £700,000 and I'll solve screen time. Or I'll solve AI. I'll make our digital society really, really good. And I think naturally it plays a role, but I think we also need to really think about what role we are taking by saying we will deliver those things. And there, Collingridge was writing very eloquently in the 1980s about science and tech and policy, saying that there's currently a huge disparity between our technical competence and our understanding of how the fruits of this competence affect human society, which has given rise to widespread hostility to technology. That was in the 80s. So I think we as researchers are being pushed into a role to sort of solve tech. Tech is developing quickly, and we come in to sort of hold it to account. We come in to show what's harmful or not. But I think partially we can do that. Partially, I think maybe we cannot always do that. And hopefully I'll take you through that today. So another example, so science increasing, so in the time of the radio, there were only a couple of scientific articles about radio addiction and what we should do, and there was a bit of debate in scientific societies, but academia was still quite small, right? Research was very elusive, very ivory tower. You'd have some people doing some work. And over time, research has become more and more larger, more embedded in our society, but also almost more kind of industrialized to solve these sorts of issues. And I think we saw that already in the 60s with the debate about the television. So in the 60s, there was a lot of concern about the television increasing youth violence. And there was a media task force in the US, which reminds me, again, it reminds me of what's happening at the moment, where they said that television violence is one major contributory factor which must be considered in attempts to explain the many forms of violent behavior in American society today. And there was a lot of debate about how you would regulate what is presented on television to reduce violent behavior in young people. Already, the provision of evidence to show whether that's the case was slow. It was complex, because media is complex. And there's some amazing work actually funded by the Leverhulme Trust. You can actually get the book out of the library, where they really wanted to do a sort of perfect causal intervention to look at the impact of television. And they found that in Norfolk, because it's so far away from anything, they hadn't gotten broadband, like the quick television yet. And so they looked at sort of when each town got television, how that impacted things. And there were big teams doing very well-structured research that, you know, one of my ex-PhD students who's now assistant professor at the LSE is doing in Africa, you know, how when they're rolling out broadband internet to different streets or townships, how things change. So again, feels very similar. And something else is similar is that then there's debate about evidence, because we say, well, we need evidence to change things, to show that our concerns are true, and that evidence doesn't emerge in the way that people want. And so there was actually an editorial in Pediatrics, a big medical journal, saying that professionals need to avoid the intellectual trap of minimizing the importance of television's effects on children and adolescent behavior simply because the literature does not contain straightforward, statistically validated research. And this is really much where the space where we are now, and that's what I'm going to talk through today. So what is the current debate about teens and phones? You know, we've all heard about, you know, we're all part of the debate. It's really a societal-wide debate about what are we going to do about young people and social media, because we are concerned. And that concern is real. I see it every single day. I talk to parents, talk to people on my street, I talk to people in my running club. So what are we going to do about it? Well, similar to the television, or probably the radio if there had been more sort of research done, the impact of sort of social media is very hard to quantify because it's very heavily individual, and because we, you know, science is a slow process. Our methods are limited in certain ways. And so the debate about how social media has impacted us as a society or our children is still very much a debate. It's unsettled. It's emerging. As written here by the editor of Science. In a couple of years ago, the National Academies of Sciences in the US brought together a big group of academics, engineers, medics, to discuss and get evidence about the impact of social media on young people. They produced this report where they really talked about that, you know, on a population level, it's very difficult to say what social media's impact is. Rather than having purely negative or positive impact, it will likely be a constantly shifting calculus of the risky, the beneficial, and the mundane that will impact different people in different ways at different times. And my work with the Department for Science, Innovation, Technology last year really did find that that is still the case. So we did a big review of kind of meta-analyses in this evidence base looking at the time spent on social media for under 18s, healthy under 18s, and how that relates to mental health and well-being. And overall, this is quite small, but we found 7 reviews, and across the board, none of them said we had kind of causal evidence of harm. A lot of them, what we did find is a negative correlation, and I'll put a lot of money that that's true. Children who use more social media also report feeling worse. We also now have one systematic review that recently came out that shows that children who use more social media at a specific time, it predicts declines in well-being or mental health. But there's still a lot of debate, kind of because different children might be selecting into those groups, what that actually means. So I feel like we're in a very similar space as for the television, where there is real concern, and there's a question of how we should act on evidence that is not where decision makers would like it to be. But let's take a step back. Maybe the question on like, how much time does kids spend on social media and how does it impact their mental health is actually kind of a stupid question. I often get asked, like, what's the impact of digital technologies on kids? And I kind of say, well, what's the impact of families on kids? You know, naturally, you would need to give me some more information. If we're thinking about families, are we thinking about number of siblings? Are we thinking about the value of the caregiver bonds? Are we thinking about family culture? Are we thinking about, you know, abuse, death? All of these will have very different impact on the person. And what outcome are we talking about? Are we talking about educational outcomes? Are we talking about sleep? Are we talking about your earning potential in 20 years' time? I think it's very similar with technological questions, is that often we ask them on a too broad level that is almost unanswerable. that don't go into that detail of experience that really matters to specify what the impact of a specific technology might be. So in mental health research, we know that mental health is determined by a huge different range of factors: our genetics, our social environment, the political environment, our parents, what we experience, the adversity we experience. And they all interact in a really complex system. There's not like, well, if you have this, then you will get this in the outcome. And something that I still feel like I have to explain to people is that in this system, the digital world isn't like an additional factor that you can then measure. The digital world is in the system. Pardon. The digital world is transacting a lot of parts of that system. It's changing not just how we interact, it's changing the political parties that are elected. That will impact the policies that are enacted. It will change how we define ourselves. And all of these will interact in ways that, as a quantitative researcher, my linear statistics will not capture. So it's important to note that it is a digital system that is interacting, and not, for example, the digital being like a drug. And I think that's the first thing that is often misunderstood, or we often talk about it like something that there's an exposure and we should study it like cigarettes, or we should study it like exposure to a certain toxin. And naturally, those can also have complex impacts, but I think the digital world fundamentally is more complex than that. So I want to go back to that question whether in 90 years people will be laughing about my research or not. I think about that because I'd be seen as having tried my bit rather than saying that kids are addicted to the radio and being a bit of a fun slide. And I think that now could well be different for a multitude of different reasons that I will run us through. The first is that children are using much more media. So in the 1930s, they used about 10 hours of media a week. In the 1980s, we were at 15 hours of media a week. But now we're at about 28. And if we think about what makes a good life, or what makes a life that develops well, what children need, things like sleep, interaction, movement, varied activities, close bonds with friends, with family. And we could think about it like a system where maybe, if it's a small amount, it just eats into free leisure time where you're tired or bored, and where actually, if you're doing that, watching YouTube videos or staring into space, it might not be that big of a difference for you. But if it's eating into those important parts of your lives, like sleep, social interaction, then that might quickly pivot into something that's very different. And so I think we should be increasingly concerned just about the amount of time, because we don't have more time. We only have limited amount of time. Further, I think the technology and the attention economy is becoming ever more powerful. There are a lot of people working on this in the room who have different anecdotes or pieces of research to contribute to this. As somebody who works in a brain sciences unit, something I talk about a lot is about reels. So short form videos that are algorithmically decided for you. And that, I think, in my data, I've seen a fundamental shift from sort of the emergence of TikTok, that young people are increasingly saying, I'm feeling like I don't have agency. I feel it's really hard to disconnect. And it's a really powerful design because we've seen it's now adopted across social media platforms. It is TikTok, but it's also Instagram, it's also YouTube, it's also LinkedIn. So we could all be engaging in these reels, and naturally there's a reason that they have spread. They are good for the product and good for keeping people on the platforms. I deleted the slide about the neuroscience. I'll talk you through it quickly though. So how we as humans make decisions, how we allocate our time is often made on the basis of uncertainty and how we judge what is useful for us and when. And a lot of times we have these decision points, like when I've watched a video, I can decide whether to scroll on or whether to leave and do something else. And in a traditional media environment, I watched my YouTube video, and before autoplay, you'd have to decide what to watch next. And that would be an effortful task. You actually have to weigh up what you want to watch. And so that sort of decrease of that friction in modeling that my team has done shows that that is much harder to disconnect from in the real structure, because you don't need to decide what to watch next, you just need to swipe. And actually, the next most funnest video might come up. So it's also the sort of what anecdotally we would call the kind of like slot machines, that there's an uncertainty as part of that. I think the content shown is getting worse. So if we think about the television, there was an editorial team making decisions about what to broadcast when. I was shocked. I think it was 2 years ago, I was talking to somebody in the policy space, and they're saying, things are coming through, teachers saying that kids are watching these videos on X of kittens in a blender. And I was like, what? And they were like, yeah, and it's actually, if you put it in, it auto-completes to that sort of phrase. So I went on X and put in kittens, and very true. It like auto-completed to that, and it was going through sort of schools, and then, kind of children were watching something that is like wholly inappropriate for anyone, an adult as well. And so I think we need to understand that public service broadcasting has a role, or broadcasting and editorial teams have a role, and that has been removed as well. I think in the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen tech companies increasingly unaccountable. I think we need to think about that from a policy perspective, and I think that has changed potentially how we need to weigh up different policy options as well. Oh, I just put a picture in to remind ourselves. And I think naturally well-being and mental health of individuals and society has been in decline, and that should be something we consider. People are doing worse, and there might be many different reasons for that, but it is an important data point to take into account. This is actually quite outdated data from the US now, but major depression incidence has increased very much in lockstep with weekly internet use. And any person in my area would say, well, that's a correlation, that's not causation, and that's very true. But I think if we're in a space of kind of collecting data points why now might be different, that might be a data point to consider. And critically, we have less and less time to figure things out. I'm increasingly concerned, about AI. Like how, if we are taking on the role of being those that hold tech companies to account and show that there's harm and make policy suggestions, how are we operating in a system which is accelerating at unprecedented speeds in a billion-dollar industry when we're working on kind of limited term grants? Like the longest contract in my team is 3 years. Yeah, I'll hold you, Facebook, to account. I think we need to be more vocal that job is something we care deeply about, but also something that needs to be properly resourced in R&D spend across both the UK and elsewhere. For example, when I talk to policymakers or others, they often say, well, cars, we figured out cars, right? Cars are harmful, and I'm not going to go into the debate about climate change, so we could have a whole hour discussing cars and whether it was a good idea. But cars do cause harm, they cause deaths, they cause accidents, they cause injury. But they also have benefits. People can move around, people are more mobile, they have like economic benefits. And we figured out a way to kind of balance those two by having things like MOTs. We test our cars, we have driver's licenses, we have seat belts, we have education in schools. And often when I talk to parents, they feel quite good they know what good parenting looks like for traffic safety. So we're sort of in a comfortable space. But if we look at this graph, I think there was about 100 years between the first car being sold and the 10 millionth. So if we're thinking about the digital world now, that's AI, but TikTok, from the first account to the 10 millionth, I think it's daily active user, it might be weekly active users in the UK, was 2 years. So for cars, we had 100. For TikTok, we have 2. But science is still, or research is still, we still have like very long journal processes. We go through very, very long grant application processes where, so I think we're still sort of stuck in the previous century in a system that is accelerating to the extent that, with AI, it is going at a pace we don't understand. And also, even with social media, it's increasingly becoming personalized. Like, if I wanted to safety test a car, I would know the make and model that somebody was driving who was in a traffic accident. I could go and look and see when it was released, what production line it came down. I did an internship at Sainsbury's during my undergrad, which I actually was the best internship I ever did. And I loved the product design of designing, kind of creating food or thinking about what the nation eats. And one of my jobs was to look at product complaints coming in and the SKU number. And then if all of a sudden more and more complaints come in about a certain product, you will have to recall it. So people complain about flour all the time and flies being in flour. That's just because people leave it in their closets for a really long time. But for example, we had a SKU number of plums come in that were moldy. And so after a while, you get the threshold and you know that that's a problem, that maybe that day something got into that batch of plums. That was tinned plums. On social media, it's increasingly a personalized experience. It's increasingly a different product for different people at any one time, a different product for the same person at different times. We don't know when we're being A/B tested on. We don't know what the current algorithm is doing. So how are we even supposed to safety test something that is ever changing? And also, yeah, that was actually my point. So in my oversimplified version of how we, in our perfect world, how would research translation to policy look like? So it might be that we start, that there's an accumulation of evidence that something might be going wrong. So that's often people working in communities, community groups, journalists. And this could be about environmental toxins. This could be about technology. It could really be anything. But people are starting to get concerned that something is wrong, and that evidence starts to accumulate. And when it reaches a certain level, we start funding research on it. So we start going like, oh, well, maybe we should really test what's going on, and if that harm truly exists, and for whom, and how big it is. And then when we get to, often in policy, it's causal evidence of harm, like very strong evidence of harm, we start testing what to do about it. We test what to do about it, what interventions to put in. And once we find the intervention that works, we roll it out into policy, into society. And actually, the issue in this accelerating technological space is that this is a serial process that takes a long time, especially if you want to get to certain thresholds. And because science is slow or under-resourced, and sorry, I should have changed this to research, at the moment, especially on social media, we're getting sort of hung up in showing that there is harm. And this is also because companies aren't sharing their data. So this is like part of the design, is that it's really hard to show something is harmful if you can't actually study it properly. And so you kind of stop that there, and it's really, that's where we are now. And so there's very little work that's being done on what to do about it, and then rolling out those solutions. When I did my governmental report last year, I was surprised and actually deeply ashamed that there hadn't been a single study looking at whether reducing or removing social media in healthy under 18s helps them. Nobody's actually tested that intervention. We were all just debating about the correlational evidence and sort of hitting each other over the head with our textbooks. And And I think that shows that where that serial system leads to delays that lead to real consequences for decision makers and ultimately for society. So I think where we are in the space about social media now is that policymakers and the public say, actually, we're done. We need to make a decision. Like, I'm not going to fight another election not dealing with this. And the public is saying, we're not going to elect you if you don't deal with this, right? And so they exist in a space which I don't envy, where actually there's not a lot of evidence on what should be done. You know, should we change design? Should we put in a curfew? Should we put in a limit? Should we ban? There's not really been a test of most of these, especially in young people's populations, you know. And so then I do sometimes think it's kind of vibes-based politics decisions where you say, well, I'll just go with what feels right. And to be fair, I understand that. You know, I have colleagues who often criticize politicians for not listening to research or policymakers for not caring. And I think seeing it from the inside, a lot of them really try, but often sometimes it's also they need to make that decision at some point, and that point is now. So Hamlink in 1998 actually already talked about how policy decisions about technologies might always have to be gambles. You cannot wait on perfect evidence to make a decision, because at that point, the technology is in society, people have been using it, you can't roll it back. It's going to be so embedded that actually our chance to make a difference is very early on in the process, when actually our understanding of that technology is also still very low. And so how can we better support those having to make those gambles? I think sometimes we then need to go and think about how do we translate our evidence in a way that helps those that have to do the gambling. It doesn't help for us to say, well, there's no evidence. We need to sort of try to figure out how to help people make the best decisions with what evidence is available. And I think there are a couple of things that I've learned are useful, and some of this will be, you know, you will know. I think trying to get us to talk about designs and affordances rather than technologies as one-off things that people are exposed to. What a technology does matters. And so, for example, when we're discussing banning social media, it's often a discussion on, like, should we ban WhatsApp? Should we ban YouTube? And it's much easier to start saying, well, let's think about what the design affordances are. What are the things that these technologies allow us to do? And what are the potential risks or opportunities of those in this policy space? And actually, for many people making decisions or new to the space, this is new. You know, they see technology as sort of off-the-shelf thinking. What's interesting is that children understand this completely. So I'm running a big study up in Bradford, and we're doing a lot of co-creation with young people, and they understand exactly this. And we talk to them about a potential social media ban, and they're like, I really don't understand this, because, like, it's really how we use it, right? And, like, certain designs really matter. And it's like, yes. No, we understand. However, and I think I sometimes come back to this quote that the barrel of a gun can, if one insists, be used to stir one's tea. It is, however, better at killing and will primarily be used certainly for that purpose. So, you know, technology can be used for many different things, and then often people say, oh, well, there's a positive use case for this. And I was really struck, I had a conversation with somebody who's quite high up in an AI firm, and I talked about how I was really concerned about the young people that are dying after conversing with AI. It's like, yeah, but you don't see how many we're saving by them kind of saying they're suicidal. And I feel like that quote kind of got into my head again, where he's saying, well, but it's really about safety, and that if designs are there for a specific purpose, they will be used for that as well. Oh, I put my slide there. That's weird. Anyways. So the other point is that we need to start communicating risk rather than evidence, or risk and evidence. So I think evidence levels matter. You know, sitting somebody down and saying, actually, we don't know that much about that yet. Actually, there's a lot of debate about this, really matters. But as a researcher in a policy space, you also need to think about how, about the risk of the decision that the decision maker is taking, because they're consulting you to make a better decision. And philosophers of science call this inductive risk. So, for example, in a social media ban, we might need to think about the risk. What is the risk of acting now on incomplete evidence? And what is the risk of waiting for more evidence to arrive? So we've had our conversation that evidence is potentially poor or incomplete, but then we need to have that conversation about our inductive risk. So, for example, if you act on incomplete evidence, there might be risks that you implement a bad policy, that it has unintended consequences, that you're unnecessarily curtailing rights. For example, rights of children who aren't being consulted as active participants, or rights of minorities that aren't being heard. Or you could have economic costs. If you're, the Treasury, you need to think about these sorts of things. And for example, I sit on the Science Advisory Council for the Australian social media ban evaluation, and so I've been reading a lot of the interviews that are coming out. And something that struck me was a young person saying, I'm actually quite happy with the ban. And actually they banned YouTube. So now I'm not, I can't use my YouTube profile because my YouTube profile is for somebody under 16. But I can still use YouTube just without a profile. And so now I can see all this stuff I never seen before because it now doesn't think I'm a child. And my parental controls have been removed. And it's a sort of interesting space where now the companies can say, well, it's not a profile, so it's not really our responsibility. The child itself is being exposed to more harmful content in the process. So if I talk about unintended consequence, that's, for example, an example there. And it doesn't mean the policy is bad or that we shouldn't do it, but it's something we definitely need to consider when we're making those decisions. However, waiting for more evidence to arrive is also something that carries substantial risk. You could have cumulative unaddressed harm. We know on an individual level that young people have died because of content that they've seen on social media. There's coroner's reports that are out there. So there is cumulative risk that if we don't act, will accumulate with potentially severe consequences and also potentially severe economic costs. If we think about sort of the cost of mental health problems in the UK, there's a real financial reason to want to make a difference if there is a problem. And so when we say, oh, well, there's not enough evidence, there's also a role for us to talk about risk, and there's a role for us to talk about how long do we think will it take for better evidence to arrive? Will it be a year? Will it be 2 years, 5 years? Because that will change that risk framework. And in the tech space, I increasingly feel like there are certain questions that are almost unanswerable. Is digitalization causing a mental health crisis? At least from a quantitative perspective, it's very difficult to give you a certain answer. I could give you another lecture on the philosophy of science, why I think that that's the case there. Yeah, how long will it take? So we need to think about not just levels of evidence, but balances of risk. So what's the risk of benefit? What's the chance of benefit, I guess? What's the risk of harm? What's the risk if we don't do anything? But also, what's the risk of harm if other interventions are implemented? So for example, if we're talking about a social media ban for under 16s, what is the risk that we're excluding a minority teen from a critical social context by banning them? But what's the risk maybe if we do a different policy, like changing their designs or putting in a curfew or putting in a limit? These are all things that need to be considered. And actually how the behavior will change. Some people say, well, certain people find community in social media now, but if we ban it, they'll find it back on sort of blog posts and other digital spaces as well. Think critically. What I've found is that often we spend much too much time discussing harm, and we need to go into do more to just test what we can do about it. And I feel stupid saying that in front of design researchers, because you've done that all the time. You just say, well, why don't we just go out and test things in the community? Because actually, you know, by testing interventions early, we're not just building our understanding of what could work for people, we're also building that causal evidence of what the actual impact of the technology are. We're manipulating parts of the system, and we're seeing what happens. So personally, that's where kind of over the next year, I'm working on 2 large studies. So the first is the IRL trial in Bradford, where we are randomizing whole year groups of young people to either be a control group or to have a social media curfew and a limit over 6 weeks to see how that influences their mental health, as well as things like sleep. And that will be the first trial worldwide to try to do that, and has been sort of heavily co-opted or kind of in the current policy conversation and debate. But we're also interested in we're doing a cross-UK study doing micro-randomized trials, so where you actually randomize small design changes to social media to individuals on a daily basis. So one day you might use a social media that's slightly different to the next. So more or less we're just doing A/B testing, but for research, and we're seeing how individuals respond to those interventions to gain understanding, not just what works, what design works for whom, but also what factors predict which intervention works for whom, not just on a whole population. Interestingly, I just wanted to talk you, so this is very much the sort of medical space I work in, but we really like randomized control trials, and for better or for worse, really. But there was a study in Denmark that I think was quite unique by looking at reducing screen time in families. So they reduced the amount of use to 3 hours a week, all sort of recreational screen time. The children had to hand in all their devices, and critically, one family member had to hand in their devices as well. And they did find really good, positive outcomes, better mental health, better sleep. But now let's put our critical hat on. What family can have one parent that will hand in their smartphone or their phone? And actually only a very small amount of families that initially expressed interest were actually included. So it's not just about what works on a whole, but what works for normal families and families in different situations. So this is where I think so Nathan Matias and I, who's a computer scientist but also social scientist in the US, have talked a bit about the concept of what's minimum viable evidence. If companies are bringing out minimum viable products with safety testing that we don't trust, and we as researchers get sort of tasked to show that there might be harm and what to do about it, how do we approach that if our current evidentiary system doesn't seem to be working as intended? And I think critically there is that companies aren't playing ball. You know, like they're not sharing data, they're not sharing resources, they're completely excluding us from trying to understand the impacts of products. And so actually, at the moment, it's a positive system for them. You know, they don't provide the data and the resources, and so we can't find the good evidence, and so they're left off the hook for longer. We need to change that system. And so going back to that linear model, the question is, how do we parallelize that? So for example, if we do have a product that is released into market, a technology, for example, and the company isn't doing their part to test that it's safe, isn't sharing their data, isn't providing the resources to show that it's safe for consumption, we shouldn't be using that linear model because maybe we'll never get to that level of evidence because they're keeping it behind closed doors. And we've seen that with the legal cases in the US. So for example, why not lower the thresholds of evidence that are needed to go to the next stage if we have concerns as a society that a platform isn't testing their product appropriately? And that could be flexibly done. Other way. For example, that you say, actually there only needs to be quite small amounts of evidence of harm for us to start testing interventions, because the potential of harm is too great that something might go wrong and the technology will be embedded too quickly. So one slide that I missed before I go to the conclusion is that there's also a conflation, and this is the last thing that I've learned, is that there's a real conflation when we talk about harm in how we talk about it. So often when, for example, when I talk to people like Ian Russell, as Molly Russell's dad, whose child, died by suicide after seeing self-harm content on social media, this is about harm to individuals, and that is clearly evidence. So I'm not saying in any part of my talk that we don't have evidence that people have been harmed by technology. Like I think we have clear evidence that people have been harmed by AI. And if we were thinking about toys, like if we had a toy where 3 children had choked on that toy, we would have recalled that toy. I recently used a metaphor that we had some cases of young people having severe allergic reactions in restaurants, again, going to severe medical harm. That was enough that every time we go to a restaurant now, you get asked about your allergens. And so we as a society have decided that that is a price to pay to keep people safe more broadly. So some campaigners say, well, why aren't we doing the same for social media? Like, why are you having to prove that time spent on social media causes a decline in life satisfaction to actually cause a change? And I agree. But also, if we're going back to the toy example, we wouldn't say, oh, 3 children choked on a toy, so we'll recall all toys. We'll turn off all technology. I think that's where, again, we get to that risk-harm trade-off that is inherently personal. And I think, therefore, I do believe in democracy and in democratic leaders and decision-makers being elected to make decisions. We as researchers provide evidence, we provide advice, but they decide not just on the basis of the evidence, but on morals, ethics, what the population wants, what their constituents say. And I increasingly see that that system is there for a reason, because as a researcher, we're only part of that picture. So when we're thinking about how to keep children safe, I often think it's a quandary. It's quite difficult to know what to do as somebody doing research in this area. On the one hand, I think it's my public duty as a publicly funded researcher to represent what the data says, to say when there isn't clear evidence, to say when there's disagreement, to say when things are unclear, especially in a world where it's full of opinion. I think there's sometimes strength in saying that we just don't know. But I think critically, we need to say that in a framework that doesn't keep companies off the hook, that doesn't devaluate people's personal experiences, and that ensures that we're working towards that good digital society that we all care about. I hope that today I've talked you through some of how I've started to think about this around risk, around kind of quickening of evidence, to really start considering how we make sure that policy evidence connection is a fruitful one. I think coming back to that history of science, we're in a fundamentally amazing place as researchers. We are asked to solve some of society's most critical problems. And I think we can do it if we work together more, if we're supported appropriately, if we're allowed to think critically and do so with academic freedom. And I think we should fight for that together. We should fight for the necessary data. We should fight for that recognition. But we also need to be careful. We are in a position of responsibility, and we're in a position of power and of trust, and that can be quickly lost. And I do also think that sometimes we overpromise what we can do on meager budgets, on short-term grants. And I do think that we need more strategy also from government and from funders to say that actually, if we're supposed to safety test a digital environment, that is not just discovery science kind of research, that is a fundamental role in society that needs a different form of support as well, in addition to this amazing discovery science that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. So I want to thank my wonderful team and my funders as well, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. We'll have a few minutes for questions, and we understand that we are standing in the space between you all and your non-alcoholic drink. I'll just keep saying it because it's funny. It's important for the people who have joined us online, hello online, that we speak into microphones. I have another roving mic here. Maybe just before, I'm going to give the mics to the mic runners. And just as you're getting your questions together, I have one of my own for Amy. Maybe we can get the mic here. What has surprised you about this work?
I think what surprised me is how personal it is. I think everybody has emotions around this topic, and it'd be like a lie to say that doesn't impact you. I think it takes it. I think I've heard a lot of emotion in the room over the course of today, right? It's not just that you leave your work at home. It takes its toll, and I think for me, I think what has surprised me at times is how difficult that is. To sort of manage for myself, manage for my team, for others, and how hard it is to separate sort of research evidence and other ways, ways of knowing and other ways of discussing and make sure that everybody feels valued. I think that's more like a difficulty. I think what always surprises me is when you talk to young people, how they come up with great solutions, amount of insights that they have. And I think every panel is always better when there's a young person. So that's the positive part.
That's fabulous. Yeah. We have a question here.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. That was great. I don't really see which society would be acceptable to have a video of a cat being, in a blender. So I wonder how. If there is, we should be talking about free speech, but that's not my question. My question for you is, how important is literacy in the space that we are talking about? Because we can talk, lots of nice, pretty words to policymakers as well as members of the public, as well as young people, but if they don't understand what we are talking about, there's no point in talking at all. So I wonder if you have a view on that.
So like digital literacy or scientific literacy?
All of it, because the school framework is very behind on that front.
Yeah.
So we would avoid quite a lot of problems if people will have critical thinking from school.
Yeah. I think digital literacy and literacy is critical. But I also, something that struck me, it must have already been 6-7 years ago, I was at an event at Ofcom, and we were talking about literacy the whole day, the importance of digital literacy, the new digital literacy curriculum. So I was at the British Library, and Rachel Caldicott stood up at the end and said, it's not just about literacy, it's about holding tech companies to account. Yeah. Like that video shouldn't be online, so why are we teaching kids the literacy if the problem is the company? So I think literacy is an important, it's an important solution because we always have to have a stopgap solution, and I'm a realist around what policy can do. I've seen policymakers try really, really hard with the Online Safety Act, and it's still really, really difficult to implement, and I think we should do better on that. And I think that's why I think also the conversations about a ban have become louder, is I think a capitulation that we think we can't regulate the companies appropriately, so let's just keep our most vulnerable groups off. But they're still kind of impacting all of us, so I think, on the one hand, I do see digital literacy and literacy in general as a solution, but I also see it as sort of sad capitulation that certain things we shouldn't have to educate people about because they shouldn't happen.
We've got questions online, I think, and if we can find out, there's another question over here.
Yes, and we have a lot of questions online and also a lot of really positive feedback, people really enjoying the talk, so thank you for that. I won't be able to ask all the questions that have been asked online, but clustering a few of them together. And firstly, it draws into what we've just talked about here. And where do you see most responsibility lying for these issues with platforms, policymakers, social media users, and parents? There's some specific questions, for example, about duty of care for transparency, about the evidence, and also about the right of access to audit the algorithms that people are seeing online, and mechanisms that are used that are akin to gambling. So this question about where does responsibility lie. And I'll add one more, which is about this risk framework. So what's your take on how we should weigh such uncertain future benefits against more concrete present harms?
Yeah.
Does the asymmetry give us a stronger reason to favour precaution? One more, actually, because it's a great futures question, which is, there's some great questions online, which is, have you got good examples or any examples of young people being designed in good policy making that you can sort of think would apply well to the social media world?
Great. Yeah, I'll start with the second. So I think weighing up risks and benefits is a core part of policy making, and there's a definition for UK government on the precautionary principle. So where you say, well, if it's, I'll misquote it now and people will be mad at me, but it's something along the lines of like, if you're releasing something that might have harm, it's your responsibility to show it doesn't, or the same with the policy itself. I think, you know, if we're saying we should do a certain policy and we don't yet know exactly what its impact might be, it's the person who's proposing it who needs to think about the sort of harms versus the benefits, but that harms do often outweigh benefits in a certain way. So I do think that, you know, fundamentally, like it's a personal value judgment, but like for me, like a death is more important than economic benefit for a company that's already billions of pounds. So I do think that harms are more important, but naturally there is a balance, and that is an individual decision. But yeah, I think there's been a lot of work on the precautionary principle, and naturally there are people calling for that in tech release. Like I think for technology for kids, like maybe we should prove that there isn't harm before children can are allowed to be using certain things. So I worked on the early years screen time guidance for government that was just released a couple of weeks ago for under 5s, and we recommend no use of AI toys for under 5s. It's not because there's evidence that, like really good evidence that they're harmful, but we felt like the potential benefit of using an AI toy was quite small in comparison to the potential risk, because so I think hopefully that answers the question. I think the first about where responsibility lies, I think in the current system it lies in a bit, you know, in one way it lies with everyone. If we take, you know, the system as it is today, everybody is in turn some way responsible. But if we zoom out, like a lot of this, I do think of the responsibilities of companies to address. There's a question about how and how we do this and how we design economic systems that incentivize that to be the case. You know, we do live in a capitalist society, and so that will matter and that will drive decision making, and companies are doing a good job to their shareholders. So I think, So I feel like we recently did some qualitative work with young people talking about sort of social media addiction experiences, and a lot of them say, well, I know it's the fault of the company that this product is really hard to disengage from. But when we ask, like, well, who can help you? It's like, well, it's just me, really. Like, I need to download this app to help me, or I need to get away. I think that's a thing I find sad, because I don't think it's the responsibility of a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old to do this by themselves. I think on the final one, if I remember it, I don't remember it. Policy areas.
Young people
Yeah.
influencing the policy debate.
So I think there's some really nice policy engagement. There's a Youth Parliamentary Select Committee, and they actually did a report on tech last year where they said we don't want to see certain types of content that we're seeing. There's violent content we don't appreciate, but we also don't want to be fully banned of technologies that we feel are important for us. So there are ways in which they are integrated. I think actually the government at the moment is trying to consult a lot of young people about this topic, and we'll see how that goes. I'm quite interested in models from healthcare as well. This is not about young people, but how policy and research impact together. So the Department for Health and Social Care has a massive research budget compared to any other departments, and that they fund things through NIHR, National Institute for Health Research. And actually, they fund things called policy research units. So there are units of experts that are funded on a more long-term basis, but actually they are consulted. They're consulted every half year or a year to say, well, what's the current policy priority on this? And then they'll do things like rapid reviews, rapid testing, sort of rapid experiments to help that policy area make the good decision on what will be announced. And it's very time limited, but and I think those models work really well, and I don't see why we're not doing it elsewhere, where you more or less, instead of having small project grants, you're sort of supporting people to work long-term with policy in a more agile way. But that's not with young people. But if it were about young people, I'd hope they'd be involved. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Amy Orben. My question will probably continue on this, finding the fine balance between digital protection and cultivating literacy. Sweden recently switched back, one of the most digitally progressive countries, switched back to pen and paper books in a school. This is welcomed by some parents and teenagers, but also faced the backlashes. Yeah. There were criticism at the teenage formative years, significant stage of learning. They would, by current policy, would miss out learning the digital skills. So I would like to welcome your comments on that. Then the second, regarding the regulation, I think in the US, media industry, ever since the comic books era, they're very good at self-regulating. They don't want the government to put guidance on them. Digital tech, similarly, following this, self-regulating. From the policy level, mainly it's from the EU, from Europe, but the content is from the US. This transnational flow of information, how could the EU regulating content coming not actually from the EU? Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I think on the latter one, I think that's where real difficulty lies, right? I think for a whole decade, researchers in my area have called for safety by design. Like, we know certain things that how we can design technologies to be safer, and very little has been done, partially because it's a really difficult regulatory environment. Like, I don't think people aren't trying. And so I also see, I am sad that we're now standing at the precipice of saying, well, I think we've lost hope that it can be safely designed, and so we'll just remove certain people from it. But I'm not a regulation or a policy researcher, so I try to keep out of how we're going to do it in particular. But I think in a perfect world, I do think it would be the role of companies or regulation. But we also need to recognize the limits that we're working in, and actually also the global limits we're working in an American administration, and other sorts of policy constraints that might be in the room. I think on the first about Sweden, I think EdTech has become the new flashpoint for debate. I had on my On a foundation's website, I described a research project I'm in, or I was leading, saying like, oh, we want to counter the misunderstanding that all screen time is bad. And then I had a journalist contact me, more or less saying that that means I'm biased, for having said that all screen time is bad, and from the edtech perspective as well. And I do believe, like, I've seen, for example, somebody in my team worked with a charity called War Child, which put in place sort of iPads in Ukraine or other war zones to help young people learn when their education is disrupted. And I'm proud to say that I do think that is a positive use of screen time and technology. Whether, in real education, how we decide on that, I think, again, the evidence base is hard to pin down. And I think what we need to do is evaluate different policies to see what happens. I think what does concern me is how certain technologies monitor and surveil young people. I just came back from a meeting with American researchers who are telling me how now schools monitor almost everything young people do on technological devices for suicidality and are flagging potential suicide risk, like to medical professionals or parents, in a way that really concerns the medical professionals who are actually involved in that space. And I do think we need to think about the commercial models around our children. But yeah, so I'm interested to see how Sweden, how things go for them. Like, I'm interested to see how Australian bans work. I think they're important data points for us to evaluate, to make a better decision in the UK.
There's a question here. We have the other mic.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was curious because we've heard a lot about how social media can harm the individual and they can potentially harm themselves. But particularly given what happened yesterday in London, I'm curious what research there is about social media encouraging people to harm others, and whether there is a cultural or a societal element to that. For example, I'm thinking about things like sectarian violence being encouraged in Myanmar or in parts of Africa by bad actors using social media to spread misinformation and inciting violence against the other. So I was curious whether there is much research into how social media has been used in this way, and also why it's more effective, it seems, in certain places and not others.
Yeah, great question. It's not my area of expertise, and I'm very wary about commenting on things I don't really know things about. And I think naturally there's critically, I think that goes back to understanding social media as a complex system. It'll be impacting so many things around, so for me, like around children, that are really hard to pin down in a single research paper or a single talk. And I think often the debate about smartphone bans or social media bans, I think it's not helpful that often everything's about mental health and well-being. I think that has a cultural reason because Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, is been very impactful in this policy debate. And that was very much about a mental health crisis in young people, and so we've gravitated towards that. But when I talk to doctors, it's also about physical health, it's about sexual health, it's about societal health, polarization, and I think all of those pieces of evidence matter. There was a lot of research on school smartphone bans showing that actually school smartphone bans aren't that great at improving children's mental health. But once you think about it, that was kind of, it's not that surprising because your mental health is impacted by a lot of other things, and just because if you use your phone at school or not, that will not really impact things that much. But, if it potentially improves attention or changes, then it might be a useful policy on another thing. Naturally, I have colleagues who've also shown that school smartphone bans take just as long to enforce as teachers enforcing other phone policies, so it's an active debate. But I think we definitely need to broaden our horizons, and often you know, I'm also quite myopic, that's my area, and so I talk about it, but I now, when I write policy documents, I try to really upfront say, we're mainly focusing on this because I know about this. Doesn't mean that all of this other stuff doesn't matter. I think that's why sometimes I'm like, gosh, this is such a massive task. Like, how should one person or even one area or academia in general understand this massive moving beast? And I think, yeah, it's important for us to know our known unknowns and to communicate that. So yeah, I won't go into polarization or the horrendous attacks or happening all around the world. But yeah, I think it's naturally a really important conversation.
Our known knowns is we're about to run out of time, and I have two people queued up for questions. So I'm going to do a double-barreled. We're going to start with, yes, Lukash, and then in front of you, please, and just very short questions, and then we'll let Amy conclude.
Thanks for your talk. My question is about the nature of evidence that is considered acceptable, convincing, credible. And I'm thinking about quantitative, qualitative studies, and in Birmingham, I think, thinking about cultural studies and how they contributed to the discussions. In your work with policymakers, do you see that they are more favorable towards some kind of evidence?
And then the other question.
My God, it's kind of the same question. I'm a design researcher. I love the talk, but I was a bit surprised when you said that we don't know that much about the implications and impact of certain design patterns like autoplay and infinite scrolling, because I think we actually know quite a lot, but what we know is the result of a small qualitative studies. So what can we do? How can we present our knowledge in ways that are counted as evidence to help make decisions?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I don't know what I said, but I do think that things like autoplay, we know how powerful they are. So hopefully I didn't say something I didn't want to, that we don't know their impact. But I think critically about different forms of evidence, like I do see, and I'm a culprit in this, where we have a sort of pyramid of evidence, and you see like the gold standard randomized control trial at the top. And I think, I've recognized the severe limits of that, especially in a space, like I was saying, where we need to move fast and we need to really understand what's happening on the ground very quickly. I think what has happened for me over time is that I was quantitatively trained as a physicist, so I came in being like, my data shows this. And I think over the last 10 years, I've become increasingly, struck by how that is just also one lens of looking at things, and that you have really valuable data through conversations and through the qual work or the design researchers I work with through the way that they work with communities. So the question how to translate that into policy is a difficult one. And actually, for example, in the UK, we have a science advisory system, and often those people who are in science advice or at senior levels are medics or kind of quant researchers. So I do think, having a look, like ever so often departments like advertise for things called College of Experts, which are College of Experts they consult, as well as science advisory councils. I think making sure to push for representation there, I think can change culture inside. I think for those early career researchers in the room, there's some amazing positions in the civil service around research. And it's something I talk to my PhD students about. If you want to have more impact, I think making sure that there are more qualitative researchers in the civil service, because I often talk to people who are quantitatively trained, and then they kind of lean towards that evidence who are working there. So I think it's a bit about representation. Actually, that isn't just about the communities pushing, that's about people pulling, and it's something that I intend to do more of from the sort of inside. I think in that parallelization structure, I think if we could iterate through those different phases of research as well more quickly, I think that can be much more effective. And I think part of that is talking more to each other. It's like often when we don't talk enough across fields, and sometimes we don't have the same vocabulary. So I think events like these really help to show, like often when I get called up, you only have a couple of hours to try to figure out where some pieces of evidence are, and it's about your network and about what evidence is available. So I think things like the Digital Good Network, putting things out there, making things accessible and talking to each other can be really useful as well. But I wish I had a better solution. But I think people are increasingly recognizing with AI that we can't do what we did before. I think this is a time also for researchers who do work that is with communities to say, well, look, this didn't work. So and part of that might be that we didn't listen to communities quickly enough, or we didn't go and design things quickly enough, or we didn't translate that into policy quickly enough. So I do think now's the moment as well, but yeah. Thank you.
I think that's a great moment to end on. Now is the moment. Join me in thanking Dr. Professor.